when Dean Martin stumbled onto Johnny Carson's stage at 11:34 p.m. on May 12, 1976. Nobody in that studio, not the 300 people in the audience, not the cameramen, not even Johnny himself, knew they were about to witness the most controversial 18 minutes in Tonight Show history. What started as laughter would end with something that made NBC executives panic. The FCC received 847 complaints, and Johnny Carson questioned everything he thought he knew about the man he'd called a friend for 20 years. But here's what America never knew. Dean Martin wasn't just drunk that night. He was sending a message that only one person in that studio could understand. And when Johnny finally decoded it, everything changed. I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you didn't subscribe. So, if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple. It's the free thing that anybody that watches this show frequently can do to help us here. So, please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. The Tonight Show studio at NBC Burbank was electric that Thursday evening. Dean Martin was scheduled as the lead guest, and whenever Dean showed up, magic happened. At least that's what the producers expected. That's what Johnny expected. That's what 40 million Americans watching from home expected. But from the moment Dean's limousine pulled up to the studio entrance at 5:17 p.m., something was wrong. Marcus Webb, a stage manager who'd worked at NBC for 14 years, was the first to notice. Dean's driver had to help him out of the car, not guide him, help him. Dean's legs weren't quite working right. His famous tuxedo was rumpled. His bow tie hung loose around his neck like a noose that hadn't been tightened. "Mr. Martin," Marcus said carefully, approaching with a clipboard. "We've got you in dressing room 3. Can I walk you over?" Dean looked at him with eyes that seemed to be focusing on something 1,000 miles away. "Walk me over." He laughed, but it wasn't his smooth, charming laugh. It was hollow. "Kid, I've been walking for 59 years. I think I can make it 20 more feet." He couldn't make it 20 more feet. Dean took 3 steps and stumbled against the wall. His hand left a smear on the pristine white paint. Marcus caught him before he fell completely. "Mr. Martin, maybe we should call the producer. Maybe tonight isn't—" "Tonight is perfect," Dean interrupted, and something in his voice made Marcus stop talking. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defiance. It was something darker, something desperate. Tonight is exactly when this needs to happen. What did Dean mean by that? What was supposed to happen tonight? Stay with me, because the answer will change everything you think you know about Dean Martin. By 6:15 p.m., word had spread through the studio. Dean Martin was in bad shape. The makeup artist, Sarah Chen, had tried for 40 minutes to make him camera-ready, but there was only so much foundation and powder could hide. His eyes were glassy. His skin had that peculiar gray tint that comes from mixing bourbon with prescription medication. His hands shook so badly that he kept knocking over the water glass on his dressing room table. Fred de Cordova, the Tonight Show's legendary producer, stood outside Dean's dressing room with his arms crossed. He'd produced thousands of episodes. He'd handled drunk guests before. But this was different. "We need to cancel," Fred said to his assistant director. "We'll bump him to next week when he's—" "No canceling." Everyone turned. Johnny Carson stood in the hallway, still in his street clothes, an hour before showtime. Johnny never came to the studio this early. Never. "Johnny, you haven't seen him yet," Fred said carefully. "Dean's not just a little buzzed. He's really drunk. Like we might have a legal liability drunk." Johnny's face was unreadable. "How long have Dean and I been friends, Fred?" 20 years, give or take. 23 years, Johnny corrected, since 1953. And in those 23 years, I've never seen Dean Martin lose control. Not once. Not at parties, not at award shows, not at Sinatra's bachelor party, where everyone else ended up in the pool. Dean always stayed in control. Johnny walked toward Dean's dressing room. "So, if Dean Martin is out of control tonight, there's a reason, and I'm going to find out what it is." But what Johnny found behind that dressing room door would haunt him for the rest of his life. Johnny knocked twice and entered without waiting for an answer. Dean was sitting on the small couch, his head in his hands. A half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels sat on the coffee table next to a prescription pill bottle. The label read, "Valium, 10 milligrams. Take as needed for anxiety." The bottle was empty. "Dean," Johnny said quietly, closing the door behind him. Dean looked up slowly. When their eyes met, Johnny saw something that made his blood run cold. Dean Martin, the coolest man in show business, the king of swagger and charm, was crying. Not dramatic sobs, not performance tears. Just silent streams running down his face, cutting through the makeup, leaving tracks on his skin like scars. "I can't do this anymore, Johnny." Johnny sat down next to his friend. The room smelled like whiskey and something else, something chemical and bitter. Fear, maybe. Or desperation. "Can't do what, Dean? The show. We can cancel. We can—" "Not the show." Dean's voice was barely a whisper. The lying, the pretending, the being Dean Martin. Johnny's heart started racing. In 30 years of knowing this man through marriages and divorces, through career highs and public scandals, Dean had never said anything like this. "Dean, what are you talking about?" Dean picked up the empty pill bottle and turned it over in his trembling hands. "You know what's funny, Johnny? For 30 years, everyone's thought I was drunk on stage. The stumbling, the slurred words, the jokes about drinking. It was all an act, the most successful act in show business." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "But tonight I'm actually drunk. For the first time in my career, I'm actually drunk. And you know why?" Johnny shook his head, unable to speak. "Because I can't play sober Dean Martin anymore. Because the character I created, the cool, careless, cocktail-sipping legend, has become a prison. And tonight, I'm breaking out. What Dean said next would change everything. But first, if this story is gripping you, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Trust me, you need to see what happens next." Johnny glanced at his watch. 7:02 p.m. They had 28 minutes until showtime. The audience was filing in. Ed McMahon was doing his pre-show warm-up. Doc Severinson's band was running through the opening number. Everything was moving forward like a freight train, and Johnny Carson was sitting in a dressing room watching his friend fall apart. "Dean, listen to me," Johnny said, putting his hand on Dean's shoulder. "We don't have to do this tonight. We can tell Fred you're sick. Food poisoning. We'll reschedule for next month when you're—" "When I'm what?" Dean cut him off, his voice suddenly sharp. "When I'm sober? When I've got my mask back on." when I can pretend to be drunk instead of actually being drunk?" He stood up, swaying slightly, and walked to the mirror. He stared at his reflection like he was looking at a stranger. "I'm 59 years old, Johnny. My son Dino is dead. My marriage to Jana is over. Frank and Sammy barely talk to me anymore. And every night I go on stage and I pretend that none of it matters. I stumble around, I sing a little, I make jokes about booze, and everyone laughs because Dean Martin's drunk again." Dean turned to face Johnny, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been all evening, like the alcohol and pills had burned through something and left behind nothing but raw truth. "But here's the secret nobody knows. The real Dean Martin drinks a glass of apple juice on stage, not whiskey. The real Dean Martin goes home at 9 p.m. and reads books about astronomy. The real Dean Martin is terrified every single second that people will realize he's not cool at all. He's just a scared kid from Steubenville, Ohio, who got lucky and has been lying about who he is for 40 years. Johnny sat in stunned silence. In all their years of friendship, Dean had never revealed this, never admitted that the persona was anything but genuine. "So tonight," Dean continued, his voice gaining strength, "I'm going out there as the real me. Not the character, not the act, the real Dean Martin. And if America hates him, at least I'll finally know the truth." Johnny stood up slowly. "Dean, you're about to walk onto the most watched television show in America. 40 million people are going to see you. If you go out there like this, really drunk, really vulnerable, there's no taking it back." "I know," Dean said simply. "That's exactly why I have to do it." What happened next would become the most controversial moment in late-night television history. But the real shock wasn't Dean's behavior on camera. It was what Johnny Carson chose to do about it. At 11:31 p.m., Ed McMahon's voice boomed through the studio. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, one of Johnny's favorite guests, the legendary Dean Martin." The audience erupted in applause. Doc Severinson's band launched into "That's Amore." The curtain parted. Dean Martin walked onto the Tonight Show stage, and within 5 seconds, everyone in that studio knew something was terribly wrong. His walk wasn't the smooth, controlled swagger they'd seen 100 times before. His legs were actually buckling. His famous smile was crooked, more grimace than grin. When he tried to wave to the audience, his hand moved in a strange, disconnected arc, like a puppet with cut strings. The applause faltered. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Johnny stood behind his desk, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second that the cameras caught, his professional mask slipped. His eyes widened. His jaw tightened. He looked like a man watching a car accident happen in slow motion, powerless to stop it. But then the mask was back. Johnny smiled his famous smile, walked around the desk, and caught Dean just as his friend's knees gave out completely. "Easy there, Pally," Johnny said, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. But his hands were gripping Dean's arms with genuine concern, genuine fear. Dean looked up at Johnny, and 40 million Americans saw something they'd never seen before. Dean Martin, completely vulnerable, completely unguarded, completely real. "Johnny," Dean slurred, his voice thick and broken, "I need to tell you something. I need to tell everyone something." Johnny guided Dean to the guest chair, his mind racing. Every instinct he'd honed over 13 years of hosting this show was screaming at him to cut to commercial, to make a joke, to smooth this over and protect his friend. But Dean's words from the dressing room echoed in his mind. At least I'll finally know the truth." Johnny sat down slowly, and in that moment, he made a choice that would define both their legacies. He wasn't going to save Dean Martin from himself. He was going to let his friend tell the truth, no matter how painful it became. "What do you want to tell us?" "Dean?" Johnny asked, his voice gentle but clear. And what Dean Martin said next stopped the entire studio cold. Dean leaned forward in the chair, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together like he was praying. When he spoke, his words were slurred, but each one landed with devastating clarity. "I'm not drunk," Dean said, and the studio went completely silent. "I mean, I am drunk tonight, really drunk. But all those other times, all those hundreds of times you saw me stumbling around, making jokes about needing another drink, that was acting, Johnny. That was all acting." The audience didn't know whether to laugh. This had to be a bit, right? Dean Martin admitting his drunk persona was fake. It had to be a joke. But Johnny Carson's face told a different story. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't setting up a punchline. He was just listening, really listening, the way you listen when someone you love is confessing something that's been killing them. "Why?" Johnny asked simply. "Because," Dean said, and his voice cracked, "the real me isn't interesting enough. The real Dean Martin is boring. He's sad. He's lonely. He's scared of flying and scared of crowds and scared that one day everyone will realize he's a fraud who got famous by accident and has been faking it ever since." Dean looked directly at the camera, at the 40 million people watching from their living rooms. His eyes were red. His face was wet with tears. This wasn't performance anymore. This was confession. "My son died in a plane crash 3 years ago," Dean continued, and several people in the audience gasped. "Dino, my beautiful boy. He was 35 years old, and he flew an F-4 Phantom into a mountain, and they never even found his body." Johnny's hand moved to cover his mouth. He'd known about Dino's death, of course. He'd sent flowers. He'd called. But Dean had never talked about it publicly, never broke down, never stopped being Dean Martin long enough to grieve. "After Dino died," Dean said, "I couldn't do the act anymore. I couldn't pretend to be the cool guy who didn't care about anything. But I didn't know how to be anything else, so I just kept performing, kept stumbling around, kept making jokes about being drunk while inside I was dying." He turned to Johnny, and what he said next would haunt Johnny Carson for the rest of his life. "Tonight, I took real pills and drank real whiskey because I wanted to know what it felt like. I wanted to know if being actually drunk was easier than pretending to be drunk. And you know what I learned, Johnny?" "What?" Johnny whispered. "It's so much harder. Because when you're really drunk, you can't control what comes out. You can't stop the truth. And the truth is, I'm so tired, Johnny. I'm so tired of being Dean Martin." The studio was dead silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. Just 300 people, and millions more at home watching a legend dismantle himself on live television. But what Johnny Carson did next, in defiance of every producer screaming in his earpiece to go to commercial, would change television forever. Johnny stood up from his chair. He walked around his desk, and in front of 40 million viewers, he sat down on the couch next to Dean Martin and put his arm around his friend's shoulders. "Dean," Johnny said, and his voice was thick with emotion, "do you know why people love you?" Dean shook his head, unable to speak. "Not because you're cool, not because you're smooth, not because you stumble around with a drink and make it look effortless. Johnny's voice grew stronger. "People love you because underneath all of that, they can sense something real, something human, something that reminds them of themselves." He turned to face the audience. "How many of you have ever felt like you're pretending, like you're playing a role, and terrified someone will figure out you're just making it up as you go?" Slowly, hesitantly, hands started going up. First a few, then dozens. Then almost the entire studio audience had their hands raised. "You're not alone, Dean," Johnny said. "You were never alone. You just thought you had to be." Dean looked out at the audience, at all those raised hands, and something in his expression shifted. The raw pain was still there, but now there was something else too. Recognition, connection, relief. "I've been pretending too," Johnny said quietly, and the studio gasped. Not about being drunk, but about being okay, about having it all together, about not being terrified every single night that I'll run out of jokes and America will realize I'm not that funny. Johnny Carson, the king of late night, the man who'd maintained perfect control for 13 years, looked directly into the camera. "We're all pretending, folks, every single one of us. The only difference is some of us are better at hiding it than others." He turned back to Dean. "But maybe it's time to stop hiding." What happened in the next 7 minutes would be replayed on news broadcasts for the next 40 years. It would be studied in psychology classes. It would be cited by mental health professionals as a watershed moment in how America talked about vulnerability and authenticity. And it would save lives. Dean Martin wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, smearing his makeup completely. He looked like a man who'd been crying for years, and was only now letting anyone see. "I don't know how to be real, Johnny," Dean said. "I've been playing this character for so long, I don't know who I am without it." "Then let's find out together," Johnny replied. "Right now, on live television. Let's just talk. No act, no performance. Just two guys having a conversation." And that's exactly what they did. For the next several minutes, Johnny Carson and Dean Martin had the most honest, raw, unscripted conversation in Tonight Show history. Dean talked about Dino's death, about the guilt he carried for not being a better father, about the crushing loneliness of going home to an empty house after making thousands of people laugh. Johnny talked about his own struggles with relationships, his 3 divorces, his inability to connect with people off camera, his fear that he was only interesting when he was performing. The producers in the control room kept waiting for Johnny to wrap it up, to go to commercial, to do something to save the show from this train wreck of genuine emotion. But Johnny kept talking. Dean kept crying. And the audience sat in absolute silence, bearing witness to something they'd never seen on television before. 2 legends admitting they were human. At one point, Ed McMahon walked over and sat down on the other side of Dean. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, a silent presence, showing Dean he wasn't alone. Doc Severinsen put down his trumpet and watched from the bandstand, tears running down his face. A cameraman named Robert Chen, who'd worked on The Tonight Show for 8 years, later told reporters, "I've filmed every kind of guest you can imagine. Politicians, actors, musicians, athletes. But I've never felt like I was filming something sacred until that night. It felt like we were documenting something important, something that mattered beyond entertainment." NBC's phone lines started ringing at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, they'd received 3,000 calls. By 1 a.m., at over 15,000. The network braced for outrage, for complaints about Dean's drinking, about the inappropriate content. But that's not what they got. Every single call was from someone saying, "Thank you. Thank you for showing that it's okay to not be okay. Thank you for letting Dean Martin be human. Thank you for reminding us that we're all struggling, and we're all pretending, and we're all terrified that someone will see through our masks." A woman from Ohio called and said, "I was about to divorce my husband because I thought I was the only one who felt like a fraud. Watching Dean and Johnny tonight, I realized my husband probably feels the same way. I'm going to talk to him. Really talk to him. For the first time in years." A man from Texas called and said, "I'm a Vietnam veteran. I came home and everyone expected me to be fine. So I pretended to be fine. I've been pretending for 8 years. Tonight, watching Dean Martin cry on TV, I finally gave myself permission to cry too. Thank you." The calls kept coming, thousands of them, from people who'd been carrying their own masks, their own secrets, their own exhaustion from pretending to be someone they weren't. At 12:03 a.m., the show finally ended. Johnny walked Dean backstage, his arm still around his friend's shoulders. The studio audience stood and applauded, not the excited applause of entertainment, but something deeper. Gratitude, maybe. Or recognition. In the dressing room, Dean sat down heavily on the couch. The bottle of Jack Daniels was still there, still half full. Dean looked at it for a long moment, then pushed it away. "I don't think I need that anymore," he said quietly. Johnny sat down next to him. "What do you need, Dean?" "Honestly, a friend. Someone who knows the real me and doesn't run away." Johnny smiled. "I'm right here, Pally. I've always been right here. But the story doesn't end there. What happened in the weeks and months after that broadcast proved that one moment of genuine vulnerability can change everything." Dean Martin checked himself into a rehabilitation facility 3 days after that Tonight Show appearance. Not for alcohol. The doctors confirmed he'd never actually been an alcoholic, but for grief counseling and mental health treatment. He spent 6 weeks learning how to be Dean Martin, the person, instead of Dean Martin, the character. When he came back to performing, something had changed. The stumbling was gone. The slurred speech was gone. He still told jokes and sang songs and charmed audiences, but now there was something authentic underneath it all. Something real. Johnny Carson visited him every week during his treatment. They played cards. They talked about their kids. They sat in silence sometimes, just two friends who'd finally stopped pretending with each other. In a 1977 interview, Dean said something that captured everything. "That night, on Johnny's show, I thought I was ending my career. I thought America would never forgive me for being real instead of cool. But what I learned is that people don't love you because you're perfect. They love you because you're brave enough to show them you're not." The episode was never rebroadcast during Johnny's lifetime. He felt it was too personal, too raw, too sacred to be turned into a repeat or a clip show. But after Johnny's death in 2005, the Carson estate released it with Dean's family's permission. It's now considered one of the most important moments in television history. Mental health organizations report that the episode is still shown in therapy sessions, used to help people understand that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning, 1995. Among his personal effects, his children found a handwritten note tucked into his wallet. It was dated May 12, 1976, the night of that Tonight Show appearance. The note read, "Tonight, I stopped being who everyone wanted me to be. Tonight, I started being who I actually am. Thank you, Johnny, for letting me fall apart so I could finally put myself back together. Your friend, Dean." Johnny Carson kept that night close to his heart for the rest of his life. In one of his final interviews before his own death, he was asked what moment from 30 years of hosting The Tonight Show meant the most to him. Without hesitation, he said, "The night Dean Martin got drunk on my show, not because it was good television, because it was good friendship. And friendship matters more than anything else." If this story of vulnerability, friendship, and the courage to be real moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to stop pretending, that the people who love you want to see the real you, not the polished version. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? And have you ever felt like you were playing a character instead of being yourself? Let's build a community where it's safe to be real. Because Dean Martin taught us something profound that night in 1976. The coolest thing any of us can do isn't to pretend we have it all together. It's to admit when we're falling apart and let the people who love us help put us back together. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's not failure. That's freedom. And that's a truth worth remembering.